Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Derek Fisher. Derek, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you all things application security. But before we do that, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got to where you are in your career at the moment?
Yeah, so I started out in engineering several decades ago. I'm aging myself here, but I know I look like I'm 21, but I'm not. Yeah, I started out in hardware engineering, doing circuit design and mechanical drafting, and got into software development a little bit after that, and was a software engineer for several years before I got into cybersecurity. And I was fortunate enough to work closely with our chief product security officer at the company I was working with, and was able to mentor under him and really learn about kind of the ins and outs of security and how we provide security to applications. And that kind of brought me into the path of application security. I got my master's degree in cybersecurity and haven't looked back. So.
Awesome. Well, I want to start us off and talk about the book that you wrote, the Application Security Handbook. And if you could sort of tell the audience, tell us a little bit about the book, but also who you think would most benefit from this type of book, who is really the audience for this, and then, how can they use it? Why do they need it?
Yeah, so it's funny because I had been thinking about writing a book about my general experience in application security and what the journey looked like, and what it looks like to be asked build a application security program. And I know that there's a lot of resources out there for web application security and development security and DevSecOps, and there's resources out there on these topics, but I don't think there was, at least in my experience and what I've seen, that there wasn't a lot of content out there for how do you build a program. There's maturity models and things like that you can sort of piece that together, but if you're a leader or somebody responsible for building an application security program in an organization, the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, where do I start? And so, I wanted to make sure that I kind of, more or less documented my experience in doing exactly that. As far as who the material is for, I think there's a lot in here for pretty much everybody. I know that's easy to say, but in reality, there's people that are building a program are gonna find a blueprint for how to do that. People that are going to be involved with helping to develop and build that program are going to find out, what is it, what is it that I have to do? What's my, piece in this, whether I'm a developer or an architect or even a QA individual. I think there's a lot in here for everybody in the engineering space to really understand how we develop security within software engineering.
I very much had the same impression of the book, that it's really for lots of different types of people. It's not just for security people, it's not just for developers, but it's really for everyone in between. It's for management, executive leadership. I think there's a lot that people can benefit from this book. So what really inspired you to write the book? You talked a little bit about sort of your journey, everything from, security architecture to IAM and application security in between. But I imagine all of these sort of different types of roles help to sort of inform, making the book. But I'm just curious what inspired you to sort of, get it all down on paper.
I think, maybe it's somewhat selfish. Like, if I, hopefully nobody from my company is listening, but if I ever left the company that I'm in right now, if I had to start all over again at another company on how to do this, I wanted to make sure that I had it all written down. So, I think that for me, it was the idea was to create, a desk reference. And that's kind of where I was initially thinking about, the book, because when I was approached by Manning to write the book, I had been thinking about writing, this book prior to them, reaching out to me. So, and again, the idea was like, if I had to go into a company and do this all over again, can I do it? And what would I do? What are the steps, and what's the kind of plan? And so, so I think, for me, it's we in the cybersecurity space, we do well when we share knowledge with others. And I think, it's important for us to be able to share, that kind of information. And I don't have all the answers. And I know that, some people that may read it may, have different opinions or different thoughts about how to go about, building a program. But I think it's important to at least have that head start, with the book.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you about, you articulated really well in the book that I've experienced in several different organizations and teams I've been on or supported has been like, the push to move security left and, the friction that comes from that sometimes when you have between security and developers, security tooling and findings. Developers are kind of incentivized, in terms of velocity and new features and things like that. Can you speak about that kind of dichotomy between those two teams and some recommendations on how to alleviate some of the tension?
Between security and engineering?
Yeah, security and engineering teams or development.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's, I think the important thing that I've realized, and this, comes from being in the engineering space and writing code and knowing what it takes to get code out the door, that we as a security organization, we can't get in the way. And I think, we've been historically seen as, we all talk about this. We've historically been seen as the team of no, right? We're the ones that are going to come in and say, no, you can't do this because you're going to, create risk. And so I think, what I've found as being somewhat successful in at least my experience is that, we have to have empathy for what the developers are going through. They don't, they're not security experts. Now, a lot of developers these days are much more security savvy than I think, 5, 10, 15 years ago. Um, but there's, that's not their day job, right? Their day job is to get code out the door, to get features out the door, to get value out to the customers of the organization. So what I've found to be most helpful is to be, a partner and to be somebody that is trying to balance the position that the developers are in with reducing the risk of the organization. And so I try to tie everything back to risk. It doesn't, we can go out the door with vulnerabilities in our code. I mean, that's just, we're never going to be 100% vulnerability free in any of the code we put out. That's just impossible. What what it comes down to is making sure that the risk of the vulnerabilities going out the door is within the tolerance that the organization is willing to accept. And sometimes we have to make decisions about, are we going to stop this feature from going out, or are we going to allow, this code to go out and provide value to the customers, and we manage the risk. And that's what we do on a daily basis. So so I think if the developers and the security team are working together towards the same goal of reduce risk. We're never going to eliminate it, but reduce risk as much as possible while still delivering value. I think that's where, we find that common ground.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I think some security folks honestly sometimes forget that some risk is acceptable, and there's also a risk of not delivering value for the business and the stakeholders and customers and so on. And you kind of articulated that in the book very well too. You actually made a comment a minute ago that made me think about something. You talked about how most developers not necessarily security SMEs; they may become more security savvy nowadays or whatnot. In terms of the AppSec engineer, we're starting to see more folks, I think, go into that kind of a role. In my opinion, I've seen people be successful when they have a good, security foundation, CIA triad, basic understanding of risk management, things like that. But they also maybe have done some coding and things like that. Any thoughts around what makes a good AppSec engineer or certain competencies that, bode well for that?
Yeah, to me, I think one of the challenges with what we do, and maybe this is more historically, or some organizations are more apt to do this, but I think having application security teams that are primarily penetration testers is not an application security team, right? We can, I can go out and hire consultants to do pen testing. I can go, hire third parties to do annual pen testing and things like that. I don't need a team of pen testers. What I need is people on my team that understand how software is developed and how software goes out the door. And we can flavor that with security. And so I think what I typically look for is individuals that know how software is developed, because going back to my earlier comment about having empathy for what the developers are going through and what they're trying to do. Um, Bringing people into the team that have that understanding of what goes into developing software and what goes into operating software, will go a long way to be able to provide true security to the organization, because again it goes back to reducing risk. So the short answer is I do look for people that have at least some experience in engineering, whether it's directly in software engineering or even in project management around developing code, or scrum masters even. But the last thing on the list is typically penetration testers, because again we can and not that there's not a place for that, but we need as what what I would say a good application security program looks like is, you are the sidecar to engineering. You are the sidecar to the development team, and your job in that is to, be the team that ensures that the developers can continue to do the work that they're doing in a secure manner. And in order to do that, you need to understand how they're doing their jobs.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Is you're kind of working alongside those folks, helping them provide some context to findings or analysis and things like that, how to remediate things. You're not necessarily just running a scan, throwing it over the fence, and saying good luck with that.
Right.
So I think you're spot on. Another thing you brought up in the book that you talked about a good bit was the concept of a security champions program, and kind of democratizing security a little bit. You talk about decentralizing it, for example. And I think this is something that folks like Chris Romeo, for example, has been talking about a lot lately,
Yep.
who I know you know as well. Can you
Yep.
talk about what a security champion program is, or what a security champion is, I guess I should say?
Yeah, so it's funny because we've been doing a lot of talking about this in my team, but so the bottom line is a security champion or evangelist, or we got all kinds of terms for it, but it's essentially if you look at a development team or a Scrum team, they're it's made up of developers, architects, QA people, and so forth, and so to bring in security into that. My team, I've said this uh, frequently, is that I can quadruple the size of my team. It's still not enough, right? It's still not enough for me to cover all the area that I need to cover, from an application security perspective. So, because we can't be in every design decision, we can't be in every Scrum, we can't be in every stand-up, we can't be in every architecture review. So the way that we, try to accomplish that is really to deputize, or have individuals within the development space that are more than just trained on what the OWASP top 10 is, right? They need to be a little bit more knowledgeable in what secure design looks like, what doing things like threat modeling, providing guidance in the sense of like, hey, when we're doing code reviews, here's some things from a security perspective that we need to consider. So a security champion is an individual that is embedded within the engineering team, that is part of the engineering team. It could be a developer, a senior developer, it could be an architect, somebody within that team that has been deputized to speak for security. And they're that liaison between development and the security team. And there's a responsibility there. It can't just be a matter of saying, hey, Jill, you're now the security champion for application ABC. There's work that's part of that, like I mentioned, doing threat modeling. And when I say threat modeling, I don't necessarily mean like the formal breakout, Microsoft threat model or threat dragon or something like that, and start doing a formal threat model. But it could be as simple as just asking questions like, what can go wrong and what are we going to do about it? And so, you know, having that extra pair of eyes within the development teams certainly allows us to democratize or to really expand the reach of application security. And really, we always say that security is everyone's problem. Well, here's us, showing that it truly is. So I firmly believe in champions teams. I know that, there's varying degrees of thought on whether they're effective or not. But I think the more people that we bring into the space, the better. And again, I can't hire enough people to cover the landscape, so we have to do it some other way.
Yeah, I'm really glad you hit on threat modeling too, because that really leads to my next question about at what stage can you really bring threat modeling into an application security program? Because I think about threat modeling as a pretty mature practice. Coming from the vulnerability management side, a very mature vulnerability management program is doing threat modeling and integrating that into how they're prioritizing and remediating vulnerabilities. And I think it's very much the same way in application security. So for anyone that's building an application security program or maybe trying to mature theirs, at what point do you think that they should be bringing threat modeling in to the team and integrating that into their practices?
Yeah, it's threat modeling's right. It's a manual effort, and it's tough, right? It's tough to bring in a formal threat model. And when I say formal threat model, again, I mean let's get some people together whether we're going to do the whiteboard, draw out the architecture and lay out like what could go wrong, who are the threat agents, how are we going to provide countermeasures and are we going to validate it. There's that heavy-handed type of aspect, and then there's the let's break out a tool, and whatever tool we're going to use, we're going to create the architecture, we're going to then check it into a repository so everyone can see it. Those are time consuming, and they take resources and they take effort. There's again the more simplified version of that, of just asking the question, what can go wrong? And that's less formal, but something that can be done more rapidly and more it can be done at really any stage when there's conversations going on about architecture. So the short answer is the earlier the better. Whether you're in the design phase or your architecture phase, that's when you want to make sure that you're layering in that threat modeling. But it really depends on the appetite of the organization of how much time they want to spend on that. One kind of thought around this, and this is kind of the way that I've seen some organizations try to square this, is that because threat modeling is a threat model is a living, breathing document. The day you complete that threat model, the next day the architecture could change. There may be a different decision being made, or a new feature being added, or something doesn't work and we have to change gears. That threat model is now out of date. So one approach to this is to really have the development team, develop their own threat models, maintain their own threat models, and have the security team act more as an auditor that comes through and checks, the validity of that threat model on a on a periodic basis. And it could be a spot check, or it could be just a rolling review of all the threat models that exist within the organization. But again, it's a labor intensive project to do that work.
Yeah, I think I like where you're going with that. You kind of talked about how to scale security by going the security champions route of kind of deputizing folks. And I think it's very similar. I've heard a lot of folks, evangelize a similar approach with threat modeling. It's kind of empowering, development teams, DevOps teams, et cetera, to do some threat modeling as part of their agile, software delivery and development practices. I think that's a great way to approach it at scale, and then have, folks come behind, like you said, as a second set of eyes or something like that along the road. So I want to ask you as well, you talk in the book about, we all see the push for robust CI/CD tool chains of SAST and DAST and secret scanning and on, right? And you talk about the noise that those tools can produce and the problems that can produce for development teams, or tension it can cause, and so on. Any recommendations you want to kind of cite from the book in terms of how to approach integrating those tools into your development process, how security can go about, providing those findings and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer in making sure that we put the tools in the hands of the developers, and allow them to discover their own vulnerabilities before it rises up to the security team. And what that means is really, can we integrate those tools in the IDE, in the development environment? Um, you know, uh, Tools that are leveraged in order to find those vulnerabilities in before code is committed will get you a lot more, that you're catching, more of that early on. Um, because once you're in the pipeline, you're you're kind of already moving towards a deploy, right? And depending on how fast you're looking to deploy, I mean, you find a vulnerability, and now you're starting to make the decisions around risk. Okay, are we going to allow this to go out? Is it going to increase our risk? How do we measure this risk, and how do we assign this risk? And so I think, if we can avoid that type of environment where, we have to make risk decisions because it's in the pipeline, and instead shift more to, have we stopped this from even going into the branch, then, we're in a better spot. So there's also constraints around licenses, right? And tooling, and where your tools can fit. So if you are paying for a commercial off-the-shelf tool that's has license constraints because you're paying X amount of dollars for X amount of licenses, then that handcuffs you a little bit. But there are open source tools that you can leverage earlier on in the pipeline that are quote unquote free, right? The open source types of tools like SemGrep and Chekhov, and you can use Zap, and so forth. So those tools that we can make available early on to developers to be able to discover those issues before a commit occurs will, again, avoid that risk discussion once that code's in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think that there's an overarching theme, as you noticed your last few answers, at least to me, is like, security can't be everywhere all the time. We need to empower people through tooling, technology, enablement, education, to kind of drive security throughout the organization. And as you're talking about empowering the folks with the tools and the insights from the tools, they're closest to the code, they're closest to the problem to make a remediation. So it makes sense to empower them. And I think that's the way the industry is starting to trend for sure. One thing I
Well, I
want
mean, just to kind of, color that a little bit more. I mean, we look at, so I'm starting to come to the realization that we're not much different than quality assurance, right? We are QA with an S, right? We're security assurance. And when you look at the way quality assurance approaches, software development, and ensuring that the quality of that software is where it needs to be, it's not the QA teams that are responsible for fixing that code, or making sure that they're not going in there and finding quality issues and then writing the code. I mean, they're creating those regression tests and unit tests, and or the regression tests, the systems tests, and integration tests. And when something is found, they're working with the development team to resolve that. And I don't think we're much different, in that aspect, that, when we find security assurance issues, that, we need to make sure that we have those tools in place. We're providing that feedback, and that we're not allowing certain things to go out the door that, break the security assurance of that software.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Actually, I don't know if you follow folks like Dave Farley, who wrote Modern Software Engineering, or Brian Finster, who talks a lot about DevOps. But they essentially just say security is a subset of another subset of quality. So I think you're spot on, and a lot of folks are starting to agree with that. The last question for me actually is, in the book you talk a good bit about software supply chain security, open source software, and S-BOMs. And I was kind of delighted to see the term S-BOM in there. I just finished a software supply chain book myself, and S-BOM isn't something written about in books a ton yet, right? So I was excited to see it in there. Are any thoughts around, how organizations are handling open source software governance, considering how much it's used in modern code bases and producing S-BOMs and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think part of me feels that it's that, and maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but part of me feels like it's very buzzwordy, right? We're talking about S-bombs. It's not any different than what I think we have been doing. I think we just finally named it and said here's something that we all should be doing. But I always, and for those of us that work in this space, I mean, we know that when a 0-day comes out or we got a brand new CVE, the first question is like, are we impacted? And it's like, well, if we don't know what our inventory is and we don't we don't know what's in our software, then I don't know. So I think I I always try to frame my job and my team's work in the context of, let's say today, Friday, we get a alert that we have a potential 0-day or CVE that impacts us. Where do we start, right? And not having that inventory, not having that asset inventory, and not knowing where what is going in the ingredients that make up your code, is a huge gap. And so anything that gets us to that point where I can go and look and say, here's exactly where we're running this library, here's exactly where we have an exposure based on this CVE or 0-day, makes all of our jobs a lot easier. Because for those of us that have been around in this, I mean, when we've seen plenty of instances where 0-days or CVEs come out, and it's like, okay, like now it's the mad scramble to find out whether we're impacted or not. So yeah, sorry, long story short, anything that we can do to collect, to get that asset inventory and make sure that we have that visibility into what goes into making our code, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think that blends perfectly into, my second to last question for you, because when you're talking about asset inventory and things that can be challenging, especially if you're trying to stand up an application security program or mature it, as we were sort of talking about earlier, what do you think some of the biggest challenges are going to be for people that want to mature their application security program or really build it from the ground up, sort of going forward, whether that might be business challenges or maybe, not having enough resources or people? Where do you think people might sort of stumble?
I think the lack of resources is always a problem. And I think from from my perspective and in the teams that I've worked in, it's about being creative. You have to be creative in this space. You have to find out how you can do more with less. Look for the ways that you can have a bigger impact with fewer people. And so, building a champions team is one way of doing that. But there's a lot of other ways to kind of get creative. The other part that I would say is extremely challenging is really just keeping up with the pace of engineering. And I point that out in my book as well, is that, if you are in a organization of any reasonable size, the engineering organization is constantly changing. There's new technology coming in, there's new development going on, there's new products being created, and sometimes it's a matter of really just knowing what your landscape is, like where's my responsibility, and what am I responsible for, and that comes down to the coverage of question, or the question of coverage. If I have 5 applications in my organization that I have to protect, well, that's not too hard to figure out. You got a small organization, you can kind of piece that together. But if you have dozens or scores of applications that are each running dozens of microservices, and you're deployed in a multi-cloud environment, and suddenly the complexity is just starting to go through the roof. And really being able to get your hands around that and understand, what where where's my area of responsibility. That's an ever changing problem that is, it's difficult to solve.
Yeah, I think that's super true. And we know that security is often outnumbered within the large organizations, especially, from the development and engineering side to security. And then also just understanding where your responsibility is and what technologies are relevant can help focus your learning and your attention. One thing I wanted to ask, we actually had a question from the audience and I wanted to let you weigh in on this is, they asked your opinion on maturity models like SAM and BSIM. And if I'm not mistaken, you rallied around OWASP SAM as an example in the book, which I'm a big fan of as well. What are your thoughts around application security maturity models?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't follow, one in my organization, but it doesn't mean that we're not, following a maturity model, right? It's Derek's maturity model, right? So, I think we all kind of know, um, where we are and where we want to be, and as leaders in this space, our job is to really think about where do we want to be in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and so that there's ways of maturing your organization without following a formal, maturity model. What I will say though is that, with something like SAM, it is absolutely relevant for organizations that are starting from scratch. And you're again walking into a job where you're now responsible for trying to figure out what do we have today, from a security perspective, and how do we build on this, to go on into the future. And so, you know, something like SAM is a great way to get that framework in place, and really, understand how we can, be able to build up to that maturity level that we're looking for. Um, but I do think, there's a place for things like BSIM as well, where you're really being measured against your peers in the industry. So, for those who don't know, BSIM is not a step-by-step maturity model in the same way that SAM is, but it's more, measuring your program against what others in the industry are doing, specifically in if you're in a healthcare space or if you're in financial space, you can look at your peers and determine or understand what they're doing and try to measure that up against you. So I think both of them are valuable in that sense, where it's a good way to start from scratch and build out what your program should look like in a few years. um, but for me, and for my organization, I think every organization's different, right? We're all snowflakes, right? We're all special, and we can't. It's not a one size fits all. So you have to take those frameworks and really make sure those maturity models and make sure that it really fits with the organization that you're in.
Yeah, it's something I think a lot about with maturity models, right? Is it's like how can we make them applicable to everyone? And it's challenging, right? Because it does depend on your industry and what you're working on and what your business case is too.
Yeah.
Um, so with that, that's going to take us to our last question for you. And I'm really curious about your answer, just based on your experience and working on the book. What does cyber resiliency mean to you?
So, to me, it's about being able to, respond, right? We're never going to be 100% vulnerability free. We're never going to be risk free. And we are never going to not have attackers wanting to compromise our organizations. And so it's not about, I think when you look 10 years ago, it was always the talk about the hard outer shell, right? And it's like we're going to build our data center in such a way that nobody can get in, and that's great. That's great from a protection standpoint. We're just not there anymore. And so it's a matter of being able to respond appropriately when you're compromised. It's not if, it's when. So building in the cyber resiliency to me is about making sure that we have lines of communication, we have lines of visibility, we know where our assets are, we know what goes into making our software. And when I get into conversations with my security team, and when I get in conversations with my engineering counterparts, I always try to ask the question: what if we, like I said earlier, what if we have a 0-day today? Like, how are we gonna, how are we gonna handle that? And if it takes us a month to respond to something like that, that's unacceptable, right? I think we have to be able to respond quickly when we're attacked, and have the ability to uh, rebuild to a good state within a short period of time.
I love that answer. And in particular, when you're talking about lines of communication, we talk a lot about cyber resiliency, the tech that we need, or, how are you going to bring things back up? But those lines of communications, those relationships that you have are just as important, knowing who to talk to and when to talk to them. So I love that answer. Well, I wanted to say a huge thank you, Derek, for joining us today. I know Chris put the application security handbook, if anybody's interested in the comment section, so you can find it. So thank you for being with us today. That's going to take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, everybody.